Hello and welcome to Ancient and Medieval Worlds, Lecture 6, Part 1. In this lecture, we're going to be talking about the Persian Wars, the Persian invasions as they're more commonly called, what we should really call the Greco-Persian Wars, because, of course, if you were a Persian, every war was a Persian war, so the name Persian War really tells us whose perspective we're seeing them from. We're going to look at this today. We're going to start in this part of the lecture, actually, with some background. We're going to actually get an introduction to a group of people called the Scythians that are a nomadic horse culture of the what's more commonly associated with the Central Asian type, but in this case came from we're living to the north of Greece, among other places. We're going to see their relationship with the growing Persian Empire that we looked at 2 lectures ago. And then we're going to talk about the Ionian Greeks, the Greeks that lived under Persian rule in Anatolia, what is today the country of Turkey, but wouldn't be called that for many hundreds of years after this, almost 2,000 years after this. So the last time we looked at the Persian Empire 2 lectures ago, we saw that Darius managed to secure control of the Persian Empire after a brief civil war that broke out on the death of Cambyses, the son of Cyrus, in 522 BCE. Now, as with many rulers with weak claims on authority, Darius decided to win support by fighting foreign wars. But there wasn't much left to conquer except in Europe. So in 513 BCE, Darius invaded Europe at the closest point to Asia, actually building a massive temporary bridge near where the old site of Troy had been, where the Aegean and Black Seas meet. We'll actually see that this is a crucial strategic location, and it's going to pop up in our course over and over and over again. For instance, this is where the later city of Constantinople will be built. So Darius was looking to make conquests into this region, but it was controlled by a group of people called the Scythians, who he somewhat preemptively ended up putting up on that palace that he built in Persepolis we looked at 2 times ago, even though he didn't really end up conquering them. But having the largest army in the world won't help you if there are no cities for you to conquer. And in this part of Europe, to the north of the Greek mainland, there were a large number of nomadic Scythians, masters of horseback riding. The Scythians are the first of a series of steppe nomads that we're going to encounter throughout the history of this course, similar in lifestyle to the later Huns, Turks, and most famously the Mongols, although not speaking a related language. With no cities to conquer, Darius lacked a target to use his army on, and the Scythian horsemen simply retreated before his massive army. Now, Darius returned to Asia frustrated. The Scythians are a really fascinating people. They're extremely sophisticated, and they really go to show us that civilization, what I've often used as a term for urbanness, right, for living in a city, which is where the word civilization comes from, cives, the Latin for citizen in a city, really isn't the only way to have a sophisticated culture. These Scythians are a case in point. They had beautiful metalwork, as you see on display here. There was a great exhibit a few years ago on Scythian culture at the British Museum. And they were very sophisticated and clearly capable of beating the Persians on a number of fronts. Now, the Scythians were actually a group of related peoples. They weren't unified politically. They were split into many different tribes, as many nomadic peoples were at the time, and they would move around. They may actually also be the origin of the Amazon myth, which has so recently been made popular with the movies about Wonder Woman. Now, the Greeks loved this idea of the Amazons as women as a reversal of gender norms. They thought this was highly strange, these women living out on the edge of the world who acted like men. And they actually do seem to come from the germ of a reality, namely, these Scythians. Now, these Scythians apparently had warrior women among them, and that seems to have been relatively more common in nomadic societies, which had to be more ready to fight than urban civilizations. These cultures encouraged a knowledge of horseback riding, which automatically made you a more competent fighter. You got this huge animal underneath you. You can move at speed. You would be practiced in archery, firing a bow from a horse. And it seems that many women were also incorporated in this, and modern archaeology has actually borne out the idea that the Scythians, of various different groups, whether in Europe, in the Caucasus, in the steppes, did seem to have women who practiced a warrior lifestyle. And in fact, Tomyris, the leader of a completely different group of Scythians from the one Darius was fighting, had actually defeated Cyrus the Great in 530 BCE, and is one of the explanations were given from competing documents of the end of Cyrus, that he had actually been killed by this warrior queen of the Massagetai Scythians. And in fact, a recent biopic, making historical liberties, it's not really a documentary of Tomyris, was produced only about a year ago. Well, one of the important results of the Scythian campaign had actually been to show that despite the immense reach of the Persian Empire, there were limits to what they would be able to do. But Darius had left a beachhead in Europe for potential future campaigns, and more importantly, the Greeks of Anatolia that were ruled by the Persians had proved loyal to Persia. And they had provided the necessary logistical support for Darius's campaigns against the Scythians. Now, who were these Greeks of Anatolia? Well, we often refer to them as the Ionian Greeks, although that's actually a subset from Anatolia. But the Ionians in particular, this region in Anatolia, this Greek-speaking region of Anatolia on the Aegean Sea, is particularly important. And this is another one of those occasions where you have to sort of cast out of your mind modern political boundaries. Much of this region is not part of Greece today, but a substantial number of Greek speakers in the millions lived there until World War I. There were massive population transfers only 100 years ago in the 1920s after the war. It's actually one of the greatest tragedies of World War I. But Greeks did live here, and by Greek, I mean culturally Greek. Certainly there were some colonists from mainland Greece, as we'll be looking at. These Greeks living in Ionia firmly had this idea of connections to the Greeks back in the mainland, particularly Athens. They had definitely settled here, but many of these Ionian Greeks were probably descended from native Anatolians who had adopted Greek language and culture. Well, while most people today think of Athens as the heart of classical Greece, with its famous buildings like the Parthenon, the origins of theater, the iconic philosophers Socrates and Plato, all of which we're going to examine in the next lecture, these only came along a century later in the 5th century BCE. As we saw last time, Athens in the 6th century BCE was not yet the famous democracy and cultural powerhouse that it would later become, but was instead riven by factional conflict until the tyranny of Pisistratus. Instead, Ionia was the origin of many of the elements we think of for classical Greece before the emergence of Athens as a major player. And during the 6th century BCE, the Ionians produced what scholars today call the Ionian Enlightenment. Homer, for instance, was said to have come from Ionia, although much earlier than this Enlightenment period. But many other early poets and literary figures who set the standard for later classical literature were also from Ionia, such as Sappho, the poet of the island of Lesbos. That's still a part of Greece today, but it's within swimming distance of the coast of Asia Minor, Anatolia. Herodotus, the father of the genre of history, and the author of the history of the Persian Wars, was also a Greek from Anatolia. But more importantly for this Ionian Enlightenment, more firmly associated with it, are the Greek philosophers and scientists, and there was little distinction in the ancient world. They would have all been referred to as philosophers, which is part of why everyone who gets a PhD is a doctor of philosophy. So, for instance, I'm a historian with a PhD. I have a doctorate in philosophy, that is, the love of wisdom of history. But these Greek philosophers and scientists really seem to have first developed in Ionia. One of them is the famous mathematician Pythagoras, who came up with a theorem for determining the sides of a right triangle, for instance. Now, it cannot be a coincidence that Ionia was closer to and more connected with the older civilizations of Mesopotamia and the rest of the Middle East that caused this flowering of Greek learning. Now, scholars debate how much the Ionian Enlightenment owes to the older learning of Babylon and Egypt, and it's likely to some degree that we'll never be able to know for sure. But it is safe to say that the Ionian Greeks were not inventing from scratch, and yet at the same time that they were also making important new contributions based on this older learning, much as we saw last time with Greek sculpture and writing. all likely increased by the new age of globalizing contacts that had been made possible by the Persian Empire. Now, it seems many, but not all Ionians, disliked being ruled by the distant king in Persia, which had started in 546 when Cyrus had conquered Anatolia from the Lydians, who had previously ruled Ionia. The Lydians had adopted much of Greek culture, which seems to have made them at least more acceptable overlords than the Persians. Now, we've seen that the Persians were deeply respectful of local customs, and the same was true in Ionia. The Persians preferred to rule these Ionian city-states through local tyrants. That was easier, but it offended the Greek notion of rule of law in a polis, as we looked at last time when we talked about the example of the tyrant Pisistratus and other tyrants. Tyrants actually were very common and sometimes even useful to a Greek polis that was developing into, say, a democracy like Athens, but that was not the common perception that Greeks had of tyrannies, and working for the foreign Persians made tyranny even more unacceptable. Why the Ionian cities ended up revolting against Persian rule in 499 is not entirely clear. Perhaps Ionians did not like just being one culture, however respected, among many in the enormous Persian Empire. Perhaps they feared that this would lead to Athens and Sparta and the other mainland Greeks taking the place of Ionia as the cultural center of Greek civilization, and they were right about this. Herodotus, the historian actually from this general region, and the writer who gives us most of our details about the Ionian Revolt, shows us that there were also complicated local political factors that sparked the conflict as the various Greek tyrants that the Persians preferred to rule through competed with each other. Historians think it was likely some combination of all of these factors that led to the revolt in 499 BCE. Regardless, the thing to emphasize here is that the Persians do not seem to have done anything in particular to spark the revolt themselves. There is no evidence for some atrocity or any other bad actions that against the Ionians that the Ionians were reacting to. The Ionian revolt seems to have been entirely internally motivated. Well, the Persian Wars, to some degree, then begin with this Ionian revolt, and the immediate cause in 499, the spark, was a failed Greek tyrant rising up against the Persian Shah Darius, his former boss, and asking a number of other Ionian Greek city-states to join in, and indeed also going to free mainland Greeks for help. Athens had just switched to a democracy, as we're going to look at in our next lecture, and it had a sense of kinship with the Ionians. The Athenians thought of themselves as the origin of many Ionian cities. Remember those Greek colonists we talked about in the last lecture, and they shared a common Ionian Greek dialect. The Athenians sent a small fleet of ships to help the Ionians, and together they surprised and sacked the local satrapal capital. But when the Athenians were defeated by the Persians and fled, they fled and they left the Ionians on their own. Now, it took the Persians several years to bring all of their forces to bear on Ionia, but when they did so, the Ionians were totally outmatched and defeated. Darius punished them, but not terribly harshly. He made reforms as well, with the goal of preventing future rebellions, like redistributing the tax burden, resulting in many Ionians becoming loyal from this show of mercy. They were not wiped out by the Persians or exiled. Remember, that's not generally the way Persians deal with their opponents. They instead try to incorporate them. They're more carrot, less stick. However, it's pretty obvious that Darius could not let this attack by Athens stand. It was going to be a bad precedent for all other satrapies in the Persian Empire, much less foreign powers that might aid them in rebellion. So, next time we're going to look at the Persian Wars proper, the first and second ones, and see what the outcome was for Greco-Persian relations.